Assassination plots, robbery schemes, sexual deviancy. These aren't just today's headlines. These are the scandals first recorded in ancient Egypt's hieroglyphs.
They lived like we did. They had the same hopes, the same fears, greed, lust, adulterous feelings.
But then as now, misbehavior had consequences. These are the seldom told tales that expose the land of the pharaohs as it's never been seen before. (1470 BC), at the temple of the goddess Mut in Thebes. Hundreds of revelers are gathering for one of the most anticipated festivals of the year. But this will be no pleasant family cookout. On this day, Egyptians of all stripes will come together for the ancient equivalent of Woodstock, complete with sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
The Egyptians had a festival, which they called the Festival of Drunkenness. And in this festival, there was a whole process of getting intoxicated that led you closer to God.
The festival began really by the passing out cups of beer, and this went on for hours. The idea was to drink steadily and continuously until most people actually passed out.
En route from a light buzz to a blackout, this ancient throng of binge drinkers would throw caution to the wind.
We know for sure the festival included sexuality. There was almost pride in both the drinking and the sexual activity that was a result of it.
What would compel normally pious and orderly Egyptians to so shamelessly shed their inhibitions? The festival, it seems, had divine intentions.
You drank the beer, you lost your senses, and you moved into another altered state of being where you could converse with the gods.
They went right to the very limit of almost chaos, hoping that the good effect of it would balance out the fact that they were doing stuff that they wouldn't in any other time in their life.
Egyptologist Betsy Bryan and her team of archaeologists are currently excavating the Temple of Mut, located in present-day Luxor. Her recent discovery of several inscribed columns never before seen on television reveals new clues about the annual festival of drunkenness and the motivation behind it.
This one is actually the very first column that we found that mentions this festival of drunkenness. The top half begins with the name of the queen, and then she made it as a monument for her mother Mut. It says, making for her a porch. I haven't actually found this particular hieroglyph elsewhere. A porch of drunkenness. Now, the word for drunkenness in Egyptian is tek, and it's written with a T, the het, and then, of course, determined with a beer jar.
These long-lost hieroglyphs reveal that on this very spot, more than 3,000 years ago, a so-called porch of drunkenness was constructed as the center stage for the festival. It was from this focal point that the pharaoh presided over the debauchery. And in the heyday of the festival, that pharaoh was the most powerful female in Egyptian history, Hatshepsut. She was no run-of-the-mill ruler. She would lead Egypt through one of its most successful eras and rekindle the ancient tradition of the festival of drunkenness, which had disappeared during previous pharaohs' reigns.
Clearly, Hatshepsut thought that the festival was very important. It was important enough that she wanted to redo it in a very big way.
The festival was a rare public display of alcoholic excess, but while state-sponsored keg parties were few and far between in ancient Egypt, beer and wine were widely accepted staples of daily life.
People would drink all the time. In fact, it was probably more common to drink beer than it was to drink water. And a lot of Egyptians were paid in beer and bread.
So it wasn't the presence of alcohol that made the festival of drunkenness so special, but the license to abuse it in public.
There are texts where people are told that drunkenness is a bad thing, and too much alcohol, in particular the stupid behavior that might result, is not a feature of proper behavior.
But before the revelers slipped into their inebriated slumber, they would seek to satisfy their most lascivious urges.
At some point, people must have been drifting off and not only drifting off to sleep, but also drifting off in pairs.
Normal social rules get turned upside down during festivals. And this is something we know from Mardi Gras. Carnival time brings different activity. So during the Festival of Drunkenness, the acts going on are an orgy by any description.
The notion of rampant sexcapades taking place at these ancient throwdowns is more than speculation.
It's explicitly said that part of the ritual is to drink and then to have sex. There's a phrase that occurs in all of the texts, to travel through the marshes. It's definitely a euphemism for having sex.
Appearances notwithstanding, the Festival of Drunkenness was more than a frat party. It was an important religious ceremony that sought to placate a fiery goddess named Mut. According to the Egyptian myth, the sun god Ra sent his daughter Mut to destroy humankind, but then had a last-minute change of heart. So he had to come up with an elaborate way to trick his daughter into not slaughtering the people of Egypt.
He commissions the brewing of thousands of jugs of beer. The beer is combined with the red ochre to look like human blood. And when the goddess comes to slay mankind, she begins to drink what she thinks is human blood and gets ragingly drunk, is no longer upset or ready to kill mankind, and mankind is saved.
Revelers at the Festival of Drunkenness sought to reenact Mut's memorable binge and come face to face with the goddess in the haze of their brutal morning hangover.
The musicians actually drum the people awake, and at that moment, they are then able to experience her, that is, see her, and she see them. And that's that moment of epiphany, of real connection that takes place.
With Mut pacified and humanity saved, the glassy-eyed Egyptian revelers were free to nurse their headaches and return to their daily lives. At least until the next year, when the porcelain goddess would come calling once again. But drunkenness may not have been the only vice that proliferated during Hatshepsut's reign. One of the most tantalizing of Egypt's lost scandals centers on several vague clues, including this ancient sexual graffiti. It hints at a potentially explosive secret affair between the female pharaoh and Egypt's most brilliant architect. The temple at Deir el-Bahri in Luxor is one of the crowning architectural achievements of ancient Egypt. It was commissioned by the great female pharaoh Hatshepsut to be her memorial temple, and she recruited a brilliant Renaissance man named Senenmut to build it.
Senenmut must have been an extraordinary architect. If we look at the temple of Deir el-Bahri, it is sheer genius. It's beautifully nestled into the cliffs and really sort of integrates itself into the landscape and is very beautifully designed.
Senenmut's rise to prominence was an uphill climb, but his perseverance and talent proved to be his ticket into the royal circle.
It seems like Senmut was another one of these officials who started out of very humble origins and essentially worked his way up. Neither his mother nor father held high titles in the Egyptian administration.
But being in the right place at the right time with the right people played a critical role in Senenmut's story. In 1479 BC, the reigning pharaoh of Egypt, Thutmose II, died. His sole male heir, Thutmose III, a son born to a concubine of the king's harem, was just a boy and far too young to assume command. It was up to the queen, Hatshepsut, to step in.
Hatshepsut, in her guise as the great queen, great royal wife, took over the regency, which was very common in Egyptian culture.
But her ultimate goal was more grandiose, to rule with the same authority and permanence as her male predecessors had.
As time progressed, she actually started to take over the titles and all of the power of the king. Now, she had the power of the king by being regent, but she took it officially.
The trouble was the Egyptian kingship was an all-boys club. So to solidify her grip on power, Hatshepsut turned to cross-dressing.
she did something which was not normal for other queens before her. She took on the guise of a king. So she was shown wearing the royal kilt, the bull's tail, the royal beard, and basically as a man.
Her getup may not have fooled anyone, but it did demonstrate her absolute authority. And behind this bearded female pharaoh was a real man with royal aspirations of his own, Senenmut.
Senenmut was a character who bursts onto the scene and who instantly captivates our attention. Senenmut perhaps was a very bright and capable individual who rose up in the ranks in the service of Queen Hatshepsut and proved himself to be of value to her.
There's a rumor that Senenmut was more to Hatshepsut than merely an official advisor, and people think that perhaps they had a more intimate relationship.
One thing is certain. As Hatshepsut's own power grew, so did Senenmut's.
He managed to turn what was perhaps originally a connection with Hatshepsut herself as her steward into a very, very close court connection that allowed him to do many, many different things.
During Hatshepsut's reign, Senenmut would hold several positions of high power, leading some people to wonder, was he sleeping his way to the top?
The more cynical amongst us might like to think that Senenmut was trying to rise meteorically by becoming the queen's lover, but perhaps he actually really loved her and was devoted to her.
One of his appointed duties was especially suggestive of a close personal connection with the pharaoh.
Hatshepsut trusted him to be tutor, and in fact what we would have to translate as male wet nurse to Hatshepsut's daughter.
And he's shown in these lovely statues where the princess's head pokes up and Senenmut's head is above her, and his arms and his cloak surround her. Some scholars have speculated that maybe he was actually her father and not just her tutor.
Normally, what the pharaoh did behind closed doors was his own business. A male pharaoh typically had an entire harem of women at his disposal who would bear several children for him. But for Hatshepsut, a sexual affair, especially with someone of non-royal blood, could have had catastrophic consequences.
If she actually got pregnant, there would be hell to pay, because then you would have had maybe someone other than Tutmosis III on the throne, and that would just break the country apart in civil war.
But as controversial as a public affair would have been for Hatshepsut, there is reason to believe it was a poorly kept secret. In fact, explicit graffiti drawn on the wall of an unfinished tomb high above Hatshepsut's temple may actually depict the pharaoh and Senenmut in a somewhat compromising position.
There is a graffito that some people have associated with maybe a kind of a mocking of Senenmut and Hatshepsut's relationship, whatever it was.
Could this be an ancient political cartoon that was meant to satirize a real scandal?
Academics get a little heated up about this image, and they start thinking, oh, it's got to be Queen Hatshepsut.
Beyond the overt symbolism of the wall drawing, there are other intriguing clues that attest to Senenmut's very special relationship with the pharaoh.
Even if we remove the supposed depiction of Hatshepsut and Senenmut, there is still plenty of other evidence that does suggest a close bond between the ruler and her administrative official.
When you start to see him do things like building his tomb inside of her complex or having his own image in her monuments, that's a step beyond.
Ironically, Senenmut's efforts to secure a position of honor in death would go unfulfilled. Sometime shortly before the end of Hatshepsut's reign, he suddenly disappeared from historical record. To this day, his ultimate fate is unknown. Could the queen's supposed consort have fallen victim to his own unrelenting ambition?
Perhaps people like Tutmosis III or others who did not take kindly to him, or maybe it was even someone else at the court who decided that he was having too much power over the queen and decided to get him dismissed or even to do away with him.
He was a man of great power, and he clearly didn't mind telling people that he had that power. And, you know, some people might suggest that that's the reason he fell from power, that eventually he tried to reach too high.
Hatshepsut, the most powerful woman in Egyptian history, disappeared from the historical record around 1458 BC. After Hatshepsut's death, her stepson, Tutmosis III, finally claimed his rightful throne and promptly took Egypt to the zenith of its power. He expanded the empire into the Middle East and ushered in an age of unprecedented prosperity. But every empire eventually crumbles. And by the time Ramses III became pharaoh 272 years later, in 1186 BC, there were widening cracks in the foundation. Private ambitions and popular discontent would open the door to a sinister assassination plot against the last great pharaoh of ancient Egypt.
What we refer to as the Harem conspiracy was, in fact, a plot to overthrow the pharaoh Ramses III and apparently replace the next in line to the throne. And it was hatched by none other than the women of his royal harem.
The harem conspiracy is one of the most shocking conspiracies that we have from ancient Egypt. It's one of the most shocking scandals that we have from the ancient world at all.
Royal harems were a natural part of any pharaoh's household. As the wealthiest, most powerful man in the world, he could possess any and all of the women he desired.
The women of the royal harem, their main function was, of course, to entertain Pharaoh, and they were Pharaoh's property. Certainly there was a sexual aspect to the royal harem. I imagine they produced many children for the king as well.
An abundance of women fighting for one man's attention is bound to cause a catfight. And in Ramses' case, according to the surviving papyri documents, it was the ambition and jealousy of one of his main wives that sowed the seeds of a scandalous conspiracy.
In the time of Ramses III, there are two wives who we know about from the text named Isis and Tia.
Isis and Tia both had sons who they desperately hoped would take over the throne. But Tia's son, as the younger of the two, was second in line behind the son of Isis. Tia wasn't about to sit by and accept the preordained order of succession. To effect the outcome she wanted, she would set out to assassinate Ramses III and spark a popular uprising that would allow her son to seize power.
We can imagine her as a very ambitious, grasping individual who wanted to see her son, and not the son of Queen Isis, on the throne of Egypt.
Egypt's economic and social state at the time could only have worked in her favor. Ramses had managed to hold together the crumbling empire during his reign, but just barely. The land of the pharaohs was on the edge of a precipice.
Ramses III came to power after a very tumultuous period in Egyptian history.
He had to fight off the sea peoples. He had to try and hold the country together economically and sort of basically physically. The Nile was not flowing constantly, so there was famine, and people didn't have enough to eat. So he had a lot of both internal as well as external kind of unrest.
In fact, times within Egypt were so tough that royal tomb builders and their artisans were being stiffed of their pay. They made their grievances public by leading the first labor strike in recorded history.
And as with any country that starts suffering from low economic expectations, it's always the head of the state that people blame. As time wore on, he became less and less popular with his people.
It was under these crumbling political conditions that Queen Tia secretly began enlisting the harem women and their families in her murderous plot against Ramses III.
It seems that the women of the harem, of the queen's palace, were writing letters and passing other messages from the palace to relatives and other associates outside of the royal palace in an attempt to create a more general rebellion against Ramses III.
The letters encouraged people to seize the coming moment, to gather men, take up arms, and come to make rebellion against the Lord. Tia understood that before a rebellious mob could stage a successful attack on the palace, conspirators inside the palace would need to penetrate its defenses. So she recruited the pharaoh's butlers, military generals, and even the royal treasurer to join her ranks. But where Tia really scored was among the royal magicians.
The ancient Egyptians believed absolutely in the power of magic. Certainly, to undertake such an action as a coup d'etat, they did use magic to set the plan in motion.
Through magic spells and writings, Tia and her conspirators sought to weaken the pharaoh.
Pharaoh was believed to have a protective aura that surrounded him and kept him safe. The role of the magician in the conspiracy was to actually remove the magical protections that surrounded the king, and thereby making him vulnerable to attack.
After months of meticulous coordination, Tia and more than 30 co-conspirators were ready to rumble.
It was going to be a coup d'etat. The people would rise up in support of them once they made their move against the king and secured the palace.
The exact sequence of events is unknown, but the ancient texts do reveal that an armed uprising ensued within the palace. Unfortunately for Tia, that was only half the battle. Despite her attempts to stir a general rebellion, there was no riot in the streets.
Unfortunately, the public didn't rally behind them, or so it seems. They were apprehended almost immediately and arrested.
But Tia's plan wasn't a total bust. According to some interpretations, by the time order returned to the palace, someone had managed to get their hands on the pharaoh. Ramses III lay critically wounded. Someone in Thebes would pay for this conspiracy. (1155 BC). A bold plot hatched by the harem of Pharaoh Ramses III to assassinate him and incite a revolution has fizzled before it can reach beyond the palace walls. But not before, as some suggest, the king is mortally wounded.
Certainly the harem conspiracy would have been considered quite shocking and scandalous. I mean, the king was all-powerful. He was the center of the universe for the Egyptians. That anyone could actually get to him and overthrow the king would have sent shockwaves through Egyptian society.
Now, with the palace on edge and on lockdown, the ailing pharaoh must decide how to bring justice to his perpetrators.
The introductory text of the main papyrus describing the investigation of the participants of the harem conspiracy is actually a speech by Ramses III, in which he appoints the tribunal of judges and claims that they are responsible for carrying out any punishments up to execution of the guilty parties.
A massive witch hunt begins. People from every corner of the royal realm are rounded up, interrogated, and arraigned. By the time the trial concludes, more than 40 people have been convicted.
The majority of people who were punished for the harem conspiracy were not actively involved in the plot. Instead, the text records that they knew about it, that they had overheard conversations between the conspirators and had not informed anyone.
Those with minor involvement in the conspiracy were given the Egyptian equivalent of a slap on the wrist. They were whipped or their ears and noses were severed. But those who conspired intimately with Queen Tia to overthrow the pharaoh would pay with their lives.
Well, for crimes of high treason, the punishment was, of course, death, execution.
Tia, along with her allies in the royal harem, was burned alive.
At the time, at the 20th dynasty, one of the favorite forms of execution was public burning.
Ironically, the person whose fate is shrouded in the most mystery is Ramses III himself.
We know that the king is dead by the time the trials take place. So I think it's too coincidental that he died of natural causes. I think we're on safe ground in saying that he died directly because of the plot against him, the harem conspiracy.
But Ramses' mummy, preserved to this day, shows no signs of foul play, no wounds to his body. So how did the last great pharaoh of Egypt really die? Could it have been the king's own concubines who carried out the crime?
We can imagine that it was up to them to actually do away with the king. He would not expect this from the hands of his women. We must imagine that they used some other method besides a sword or a knife or some metal implement. Certainly the ancient Egyptians had a very full pharmacopoeia of lethal poisons that they could have utilized.
However it happened, his death meant that Ramses IV, the son of Isis, would indeed become pharaoh as planned. But his reign would be short, as would those of most of his successors. The glory days of Egypt were over, and the empire was in the throes of a long, steady fade into oblivion.
Egypt slowly and gradually became destitute. Egypt had lost all credibility, really, with the outside world. Their economy was depressed, inflation was high, unemployment as well was high, and the kings were too weak to make it right.
As the Golden Empire unraveled, the masses became increasingly hungry, the politicians increasingly corrupt, and the kingdom increasingly lawless. From within this decaying framework, an enterprising network of criminals emerged, who brazenly began stealing from the treasure-packed tombs of deceased pharaohs and VIPs.
Tomb robbery was something that the Egyptians had done throughout their history, but there seems to have been a marked upsurge during the 20th dynasty because economically and socially the country was a mess. People weren't getting paid properly, they didn't have access to food, their children were starving. So they would go and ransack royal tombs and the tombs of nobles and take what they could.
But tombs, especially royal ones, were protected by the grace of the gods. Disrupting a mummy and its eternal resting place was one of the most blasphemous crimes an Egyptian could commit.
In order to effectively and quickly remove the amulets and the other precious metals from burials, the mummies themselves would be destroyed, and often the wooden furniture and other burial objects and coffins would be set on fire in order to more quickly extract the precious metals. So not only were you robbing the dead of the goods with which they were buried, but it was a very, very destructive process.
But for many of Egypt's poverty-stricken peasants, desperate times called for desperate measures. And even though tomb robbing was punishable by execution, there was no shortage of bandits willing to take the risk.
The rewards of success were great because there you have a real bonanza of gold and silver and really high quality stuff that if you can get away with it, you've made it rich.
Tomb robbery wasn't a new concept to this generation of Egyptians. The Great Pyramids of the Old Kingdom had once been ripe targets for thieves in search of a windfall.
In the Old Kingdom, there were very obvious, opulent monuments, pyramids. You really couldn't miss them.
You can see these things from miles away. You might have 35,000 people working on them at any one time. You might look at these as shining beacons that advertise the sign, "Rob me."
But over the course of 1,500 years, the pharaohs had learned their lesson. During the New Kingdom, they tried to prevent the same fate from befalling their burial places by hiding them hundreds of feet underground in the hills of Thebes' western desert. This came to be called the Valley of the Kings.
By the time you get around to the New Kingdom, the kings wanted to focus on secrecy, but they wanted to keep their tombs, where their bodies were interred, completely safe and secret. And so they set about separating them and had the Valley of the Kings as a sacred, very off-limits, well-guarded place for the royal burials.
But in 1111 BC, despite all attempts at secrecy, a group of bandits found their way into the royal tombs. How? Turns out it was an inside job. 1111 BC, the Valley of the Kings is teeming with workers and artisans hired to build lavish secret tombs for the Egyptian royal family. But with the economy in tatters, their salaries were not what they used to be. So several among the gang decided to exploit their insiders' knowledge of the tombs and supply their meager incomes with thievery.
There was a set conspiracy on the part of individuals, many of whom were already involved with the creation, carving, and decoration of these secret hidden tombs of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, who created a whole gang of thieves.
We know that 100 deben of copper was what people got for robbing each tomb, and that was about 10 months' worth of wages for people. During the 20th dynasty, there were a great many robberies, and one of the people who has emerged as a ringleader is called Amenhotep.
Tired of the daily grind, Amenhotep was eager to try his hand at tomb raiding. But he quickly learned that making easy money was hard work. When he was caught red-handed with treasures from one of the royal tombs, he had to grease the right palms to get himself out of trouble.
He managed to pay a bribe to his captors, who were really the police, and got away scot-free.
With the hard times hurting everybody, it's no surprise that the police were so easily bought. But they weren't the only officials in on the action. It seems the mayor of Western Thebes, Pawero, was in cahoots with the tomb robbers, looking to take home some extra cash of his own.
Pawero had made a sort of agreement with various people, stoneworkers, goldsmiths, policemen, army officials, scribes, who all worked on the West Bank, and this gang went around robbing the tombs.
The very man whose job it was to protect the sacred burial grounds was giving the thieves the green light. When Passer, the rival mayor to the east, got wind of the scheme, he went right to the higher authorities to blow the whistle.
Passer made a report to the vizier that there were tombs that had been looted.
The eastern mayor is trying to really ruin the reputation of the mayor of the West. And by uncovering this scandal that's come under his watch, it would really undermine Pawero's power.
But the Western mayor, Pawero, was quick to cover his tracks. He used Amenhotep as a scapegoat by exposing his earlier tomb robbery. Pawero knew that the tomb was surrounded by others that remained intact. By steering the investigation there, he could make the robbery look like an isolated incident.
A series of inspectors go out, and what they do is they cross over to the West Bank and they begin to inspect the tombs of the pharaohs of Egypt's past.
There were 10 tombs they investigated. 9 were, in fact, found to be intact. Well, Passer has egg on his face.
Pawero was quick to take credit for the undisturbed tombs, and equally quick to focus all the blame for the robbery on Amenhotep. With no one left to buy off, Amenhotep was dragged in front of the vizier and confessed to raiding a royal tomb with 7 quarrymen.
And we have something extraordinary here. It's really a gem from the ancient world. Actual court testimony of these robbers, who then tell the exact story of how they broke into the tombs of some of these pharaohs of Egypt's past, tore off the jewelry, tore off the gold, and then sold or traded the goods that they got for whatever it is that they wanted.
At the end of Amenhotep's confession, the Great Hall sat in stunned silence. It seemed the fate of the Ring of Thieves was sealed. But before being thrown to the fishes, Amenhotep had one last chance to sing like a canary.
He probably decided that he was not going to take the fall himself, and so he started blowing the whistle on some corrupt officials who were a party to this.
The guards dragged him kicking and screaming from the courtroom.
People such as Amenhotep would have been punished very severely. They would have been impaled, or they would have had the eyes, nose, mouth, and ears all cut off. Their names would have been expunged from any but the trial records so that they could not live in the afterlife.
At the time, it seemed that no one paid attention to Amenhotep's final outburst. But a year later, the vizier, who was the equivalent to Egypt's prime minister, decided to launch a full investigation into the tomb robbing scandal. This time the focus was on the puppet masters who pulled the strings.
Pharaoh was punished not just because he had lied, but he had also condoned and, in fact, aided and abetted tomb robbers.
Tomb robbery didn't end with the case of Amenhotep. There were plenty of other bandits lurking in the shadows with their eyes on the prize. Raiding parties would continue to plague Thebes for centuries. Eventually, the mummies of the new kingdom would have to be exhumed and secretly reburied, sans treasures, high in the hills above the city. Today, the booty they took to their graves is long gone, but their bodies are still with us. And their mummies may still conceal a secret so unbelievable it could rewrite everything we think we know about ancient Egypt and cause a modern scandal of its own. Opium, lotus flower, beer and wine. Narcotics and alcohol were not only available in ancient Egypt, they were an integral part of everyday life.
The ancient Egyptians had a great many mind-altering substances that they used both for pleasure, religion, as well as for medicines.
But regardless of how stewed the Egyptians may have gotten, no one ever took them for cokeheads. That is, until a German toxicologist and her team published a startling report in 1992. The results of a standard drug test on a set of 3,000-year-old Egyptian mummies threatened to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the ancient world.
The Egyptological community was rocked. She said that the mummies that she'd tested for toxics actually had nicotine and cocaine residues in them.
Nicotine and cocaine are New World plants. What the heck are they doing found in substantial quantities in Egyptian mummies?
Before the time of Columbus, coca leaves and tobacco plants were thought to have existed only in the Americas. But these bodies were mummified in Egypt almost 3,000 years earlier. Could the ancient Egyptians have been part of an ancient transatlantic drug cartel? The idea was too controversial for most scholars to even entertain.
I would have to say that most people, especially Egyptologists, could not believe it. There had to be something wrong.
What was causing these seemingly impossible results? Was there a flaw in the testing method that was causing false positives? Or could there have really been contact between Egypt and the Americas thousands of years before Columbus?
And there was a great furor, and then people said, well, could this possibly be true? We should remember that Thor Heyerdahl built a reed boat called the Ra-2, which he launched off the coast of Africa and made a foray into the New World.
Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer famed for his ocean crossings and primitive rafts, set sail in a traditional Egyptian vessel in 1970. His goal was to travel halfway around the world in a boat made of papyrus, a material that was widely available in ancient Egypt. He pushed off from Morocco, and 57 days later, he made landfall on the shores of Barbados.
He showed that a reed boat could successfully survive an ocean voyage.
If the ancient Egyptians had the resources to construct a seaworthy boat, what would have stopped them from swinging by South America for some coke and smokes?
Now, the Egyptians were very good sailors up and down the Nile. It was their national highway, so to speak. But when it came to open water sailing, all indications is that they were somewhat timid and that they were shore huggers.
There's not even evidence that the Egyptians went as far as England, you know? So the idea that somehow there was materials were traveling back and forth between 1000 BC Egypt and 1000 BC Peru is, to me, really hard to understand.
If they didn't make it across the Atlantic themselves, then could the Egyptians have been the end users in an international cocaine supply chain?
It's much more believable that the ancient Egyptians traded with people, who traded with other people, who traded with other people, and that's where you get the New World things. But surely if they were doing that, they wouldn't just be bringing hallucinogenic plants back. You would also expect, you know, stones or gold or other things which are of immediate recognizable value.
With zero archaeological evidence of other New World products making it to Egypt, and no mention of cocaine and nicotine in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, experts couldn't help but question the science that started the debate. One leading cause of false positives in toxicology tests, especially in ancient specimens, is third-party contamination. Could the so-called cocaine mummies have been exposed to New World narcotics in the centuries after the Age of Exploration? Among the skeptics, this is the most popular explanation for the German results.
Cocaine was widely used by members of the aristocracy and wealthy people around the turn of the 18 to 1900s. Some of the mummies, at least, in the Munich collection had in the past been owned by members of the German royal family. It's not entirely impossible that those members of the royal family were indulging in the use of cocaine.
At one point, people used tobacco leaves to help keep away insects and pests in museum storage in Egypt as well as in other places. And it's quite conceivable that the contact with the tobacco leaves, plus all the many people who used to smoke the lovely Egyptian cigarettes over them, might have sort of seeped into the skin and given these results.
Council also believes the contamination could have come from the very lab where the original tests were performed.
The German laboratory is a routine forensic laboratory where modern-day samples are being tested on a regular basis. So the possibility of contamination of equipment or other contamination within the laboratory environment is not impossible by any means.
But until more tests can be conducted on the original cocaine mummies, a final verdict may not be possible.
Without testing the German mummies themselves, we can't say for definite whether there's any cocaine present on those mummies.
If the tests are redone and recarried out on the same mummies, I think that would be quite interesting to see what the results are.
If the theory does prove true, it will make for a modern scandal of historic proportions.
If one could actually prove the fact that there was some kind of contact, either direct or indirect, between the old world and the new, it would be fantastic, and it would change world history, not just Egyptian history.
Even if the results turn out to be something relatively mundane, and maybe they aren't, maybe they'll turn out to be something extraordinary, it is at least opening our minds to possibilities.
The mystery of the cocaine mummies remains unsolved, awaiting new evidence that puts the speculation to rest once and for all. But based on what we do know about the ancient Egyptians, one conclusion is inescapable.
Scandals and scandalous behavior certainly existed in ancient Egypt. And what's particularly interesting is that we have so much evidence for it. From administrative texts, we can reconstruct interesting stories of both good and bad deeds that various people committed over the 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history.
I'm always startled by the fact that they lived lives that are remarkably similar to ours. And I don't think fundamentally over the past 5,000 to 10,000 years, people have changed very much.
The ancient Egyptians may have been the most advanced people of their time, but they too were prone to the inherent weaknesses in the human character. Today, they are long gone, but their scandals live on.